Okay, welcome back. For this discussion, we're going to look at um, Poetry Week 3 internal and external um, poems. And I have a selection listed on the blackboard for Seamus Heaney's Punishment, Percy Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, George Herbert's Easter Wings, and Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. So we'll start off first with Seamus Heaney. So what you need to really understand about Seamus Heaney is that he was a prolific Irish scholar in the early part of the 20th century and the mid part of the 20th century. Um, he was extremely knowledgeable about literature and the history of literature and poetics. And language in itself. In many ways, he was kind of the Irish Tolkien when it comes to the academy and the scholarly pursuits. He's probably most known for his translation of Beowulf, which was, as you probably heard of, is one of the oldest poems, if not the oldest lyrical poem. In the English language. It was originally written in Old English, and Seamus was not one of the first ones to translate it, but the manner in which he translated has been universally accepted as being the top translation. And I love the way he did it because the way that the book is set out is you have the Old English on the left-hand page, and then you have the Modern English on the right-hand page. So you can kind of follow along and see how the words have changed from Anglo-Saxon period all the way up to Modern English. It's a very cool translation. So if you're ever able to get your hands on that book, you won't be disappointed. It's very well done. Um, as I said earlier, Seamus was an Irish scholar, and he grew up in the time in Ireland when there were a lot of troubles. I mean, there technically still are today, but thanks to the peace accord back in 1998, 99, a lot of that violence and hatred and social separation has died down in Northern Ireland. But a lot of these struggles, these political struggles between those who wanted to be pro-Irish and those who wanted to be pro-British, versus those who wanted to stay true to Catholic teachings in Ireland, because Ireland is a dominant Catholic country, whereas the UK is more Protestant. You have that religious confrontation that's still going on there today as well. And Seamus was basically sitting on the front lines watching this, as many people were in Ireland and England at the time. And he saw a lot of atrocities that were carried out in the name of being pro-Catholic or pro-Irish versus pro-Protestant and pro-British. There were a lot of bombings, a lot of murder, a lot of death. I mean, it was all of the atrocities that you can think of mankind can carry out against itself were carried out in Ireland during the 20th century. Like I said, the early part and the middle part of the 20th century was really rough, especially in the northern part of Ireland. And Seamus got to see this firsthand. And his poem Punishment, on page 539, his poem Punishment has some undertones of what was going on in Ireland at the time. If you look through, as you read through the poem, you realize that what he's describing here in this scene with the imagery is at the time what they perceived was a small child that was unearthed in peat moss. Okay, so this child lived many hundreds, probably thousands of years ago, and the body was well preserved. And he noticed small things about the condition of the body, and well, let's just read through some of it here. Like I said, on page 539, I can feel the tug of the halter at the nape of her neck, the wind on her naked front. It blows her nipples to the amber beads. It shakes the frail rigging of her ribs. I can see her drowned body in the bog, and the weighing stone and the floating rods and boughs. So as you can see here, he's describing the scene of looking at this small child whose body is preserved into this peat moss, and from the condition of it and the look, he can infer that this child was possibly murdered, punished for some reason. And even though it was unknown at the time, it was actually a small boy. It wasn't actually a girl, it was a small boy, but that's neither here nor there. The conceit that Seamus is bringing forth in this poem, and the allegory that he's intending, is to offer a glimpse of what it was like to live in Ireland during this time. He really felt like Ireland was wrapped in chains, needlessly, and the violence that was carried out as a result of that was destroying a country that he loved. You know, a lot of times we personify countries as being, feminine, and so he's using this image of a girl that has been punished and tortured, to represent his dear beloved Ireland at the time because of what was going on. And he really calls out the IRA, which was the Irish Republican Army. It was the militant wing of the Catholic and pro-Irish political party in Ireland at the time. And he was really calling them out for a lot of the atrocities that they were carrying out. It's somewhat of a morbid, graphic type of poem, but it also shows a shift that's taking place in the 20th century, where the content becomes a little more realistic, and the style in which it's written is not in the traditional sense. When we go back to Shakespeare, we see that there's that beat that's carried out consistently through the line, and the metric that's being used to craft the lines is consistent, as you can see here in Seamus's poem. This one does not have any indication of that. This is written more of in a free verse kind of format, where you don't really have a consistent meter or rhyme that's present within the text. So if you're wanting a little more information about the context of the poem, you can read the description on page 540. They really break down the imagery that's being used and the epithets, and talking a little bit about the poem structure and the content and the allegory that's present within Seamus Heaney's poem. Okay, so the next one that we're going to talk about is Percy Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. Now, Percy Shelley was another one of these romantic poets from back in the 1800s. He was good friends with Lord Byron, George Gordon, Lord Byron, the poet. Several of you probably recognize the last name because his wife, Mary Shelley, is the author of the novel Frankenstein's Monster. Okay. And so, in fact, it's been somewhat intimated here and there that Shelley actually wrote that for her. I don't subscribe to that theory. I don't even really think it's important to even go there. But anyway, there is that. That is there present in that school of thought. So again, we're talking about Shelley, who is a romantic. And if you remember in the last video, we talked about the purpose of the romantic poets. Um, One of their purposes was to kind of get back to a more provincial, rural sense of life in a rapidly urbanized world. There are a lot of nature um, epithets that are used and motifs, simplicity, nature, um, slowing down. All of those are things that the Romantics really focused on, when they were writing their poetry. So Percy Shelley, in this poem, kind of somewhat of a lengthy poem compared to the ones that we've read before. Um, but this one is no different. I mean, this one is written to an aspect of nature that was very important to him, and it was an ode to the west wind. Now, what's important about the west wind? Well, the west wind is typically indicative, especially you got to understand how the British Isles and their natural climate is set up. They're right there on the coast in the North Atlantic. Um, Even though that they're latitudinally speaking are very high up in located very high close towards the poles than you would say many of the places down here. The Gulf Stream that runs down here in the Gulf of Mexico actually encircles, travels all the way across the Atlantic up into the North Atlantic, and it circles England and the British Isles, and that kind of moderates their climate, so to speak. That's why it's really foggy. If you've ever been to London, that's why it's very foggy during certain times of the year. Typically, most of the times of the year. So the west wind was always looked at as bringing some type of change to a climate or a subclimate that is just dragging on forever. And so Shelley uses the west wind as a metaphor for not only that natural phenomenon that brings about change in the climate, but also how it brings about change in our own lives. Got a few notes here that I really wanted to focus on with this poem. Thought it broke it down very well. Let me find it here real quick. Yeah, so this poem, as you can see, is divided into 5 sections, and it's written in a stanza format, and there's 5 different sections in here, and it is really looking at 5 aspects of the west wind. Although the first 3 describe how the wind's power to bring autumn to the land, to the sky and sea respectfully, bring about that change in the climate. And it's not only in the autumn, but it's also in the springtime as well. In the heart of winter, that west wind usually ushers in an indication that, oh, wow, spring is getting ready to come. Okay, and so that you're really looking at in these first 3 sections here, Shelley commenting on how this natural phenomenon really shapes and brings about changes in the climates, not only in England, but also in other places. You got to remember, Shelley traveled around all over Europe and took note of these different natural effects that was happening in nature and within the climate. But that's not the only thing he really focuses on. Stanza 4, he kind of, as within an ode, you get a shift in the emotion. Stanza 4, Shelley shifts. And the shift that he's creating here is one that we're not focusing on the west wind as an aspect of climate change, or a small section of climate, changing of the seasons. He's talking about how it's had an effect on him. And in this 4th section, he kind of laments to that, because he can feel that age catching up with him, and it's almost like the west wind is indicative of the natural process of change, not only within the natural world but also within us. um, and he laments to that. So he laments that the poet, since his boyhood, has been chained and bound and lost the freedom that he once shared with the wind. In other words, he's lamenting the fact that he's growing old, and he no longer is wild and free as young boys are to go and play in the wind and enjoy nature as children often are encouraged to do. He's an adult and he's forced to, um, have life get in the way, and he's lamenting to that fact. And then you move on to the fifth stanza here, um, where he talks about how the west wind is a force of inspiration that can breathe new life into a poet's words, and spread them throughout the world just within the poem itself. So this fifth stanza is almost um, a declaration of, even though this is happening, even though these natural forces bring about change, good and bad, even and bring about change within us, metaphorically speaking, as we grow older and our looks change and our energy levels change. Um, he's rejoicing in the fact that, writing all of these things down, the west wind is being personified, and remembered through his words, and will always carry on even after he's gone. And hopefully that west wind will affect other people and bring about change in their lives as well. So really, this is unfortunate because there is a lot to talk about when it comes to poets like Shelley and Wordsworth and John Keats, along with Coleridge and um, Lord Byron. But unfortunately, we've just run out of time, and then coming to this online environment has kind of really put us in a different situation where we just don't have time to focus on that. I do encourage you, if you are interested in these poets and the lives that they lived and the words that they've left behind, if you find that you have an affinity towards it, I do encourage you to sign up for a British literature course, specifically one that focuses on poetry, at some point in your college career, because I don't think you'll be disappointed. The next poem that we're looking at is called Easter Wings by George Herbert. Now, this one is a very short poem. It's one that is not really, I wouldn't say that it's a famous poem. I didn't come across George Herbert until I took one class in graduate school. My head professor at the time, he was all about George Herbert. And the reason why I wanted to showcase this one is because it really shows you how poetry is a different type of art form. It's not one that's just in your face, matter of fact. Not every poem out there is written to create some kind of hidden meaning for you to kind of figure out with your little decoder ring or your decoder app on your Apple Watch or whatnot. Some of them are just an exercise in wordplay, trying different techniques and crafting words and joining them in a certain way that it brings about, a certain image or a certain symbol or whatnot. George Herbert is doing exactly this with Easter Wings. This poem is a religious type of poem, but if you notice that the page is actually shifted into the landscape position, and it was actually published that way because the way that Herbert crafted as you can see here, I'm going to throw it up here, the way that Herbert crafted the words, you have these, originally it looks like this, but when you rotate it, into the landscape position, it looks like wings. Okay. That was the whole intent, was to write a poem that commemorates a religious, conceit, and the symbolic nature of that poem was in the actual structure of the poem itself, with the Easter wings. Okay. Like I said, it's a very short poem. There's not a lot to it. I mean, it is more of one of religious in nature, commemorating um, Easter. And, it's just a wonderful little exercise in wordplay. So, having said that, we'll move on real quick to Dylan Thomas. Now, Dylan Thomas is one that most people really love this poem, because mainly it's written in a modern voice that you can understand. You don't have to sit there and look up words from an archaic age and try to figure out, okay, what does this word mean. This one is really straightforward, and it's one that really, I think, comes at a perfect time, considering what we're going through right now. Do not go gentle in that good night, which is on page 559. We're talking about a theme here of where there's really many different themes. So Dylan Thomas wrote this. He was an American author, wrote about various subjects, and used different types of styles to focus on. But this one is probably his most famous piece, because it was written while his father was dying of, I think it was cancer. I can't remember. I have to look that up and answer that question if anybody's interested. But all I know is that his father was lying in the deathbed, and I mean, he was gravely ill. And this deeply affected Dylan Thomas, like it would all of us. Nobody wants to watch their parent suffer and die like that. And Thomas decided to use this as a metaphor for the fight that his father put up, and that he was raging against death, and that he was going to fight it till the end. And that deeply affected Dylan Thomas, and he wrote this wonderful piece that is a metaphor not just for someone who's gravely fallen ill from some type of disease of the body, but also of the mind. So let's read it real quick, because this is by far one of my favorites. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage against the dying of the light. So what does he mean by that dying of the light? He's talking about the light that's inside of all of us, life itself, that divine spark, if you want to call it. Though wise men know their end is dark and right. Hold on, let's go back there. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in Green Bay, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men, near death, who see the blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now for your fierce tears I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. So there's many different things that's going on in this poem. The central figure is his father, and he's sitting there watching him struggle and get to the point where he's about to give up. And Dylan Thomas is like, no, you just keep fighting, keep raging. And his motivation for that, his inspiration for that is, look at all of the things that we go through in this life. if it were just such, if it were inevitable, half of us wouldn't even be here right now at the first encounter of some type of situation that seems overwhelming, some obstacle that seems like you just can't get over. Um, and that's what he's commemorating here, is that sheer force of human will to struggle and overcome any circumstance. And I really think that this poem is wow, it is needed right now more than ever. It's just a wonderful piece about persevering and having the tenacity to overcome any situation that you're in, whether it's one that's natural or metaphysical or whatnot. Okay, so those are the poems for week 3. Now, I just want to take the final 5 minutes here to talk about where do we go from here. As you know, May 5th is the date of the final exam. That is the last day I can accept any assignments for this course. I know, I've got a liberal policy, because of what we've gone through and the changes that we've had to make. But I'm at a point where May 5th is just the last day that I can do anything, because that's the date of our final exam. So I lost my train of thought here. Okay, so what I need you to do is, between now and then, I really need you to speed things up. If you have fallen behind, I really need you to engage with that blackboard, go through and make sure that you have every assignment completed. Those of you who have not done the drama section yet, I would encourage you to go ahead and get that out of the way now, because if you wait till after the paper is due, you're going to run out of time. Go ahead and knock that thing out now. It's not a lot of content, is not very difficult. It's just some discussions along with an online quiz. Okay, so I really need you to go through that and knock that out. And then the poetry section, the assignment that's due on May 5th is not that difficult either. You're basically required to go through and pick one of the authors, write about his life, and then write about the work that you've selected. Again, it was my best method of kind of changing to this online environment at the last minute. Now, let me speak to those of you who haven't participated probably since the first month. You really need to get in touch with me quickly, either by email or by phone, because we need to discuss what your options are. Because I don't want you to get to the end of this month and find out you've got a failing grade because you haven't turned any assignments in. So for those of you who have not participated in a long time, you really need to get in touch with me ASAP, because we need to discuss what your options are. Okay, I've got a few more housekeeping things that I want to send out, but I'll send those out during email. So make sure that, from here on out, every day, check your email, check Blackboard. Okay, if you get a notification in your email that there's something changed in Blackboard, you need to log in immediately. Okay, unless you're taking care of life or work or whatnot, I understand that. But if you're home with nothing to do, I would check that ASAP, because it's at your benefit to do so. Okay, I really hate. I tell you what, I'm just going to leave. I'll leave the closing comments for another video. I'm not going to worry about it now. So anyway, so regarding week 3, if you have any questions or comments, email me, call me. Please let me know any way I can assist you. And then, also in addition to that, make sure you go back through Blackboard and check all of the assignments. Make sure that you've got everything up to date and turned in on time. I'm going to spend the rest of this week to get caught up on the grading for those of you who have turned stuff in. Okay. All right, guys, stay safe out there. Stay home, and we'll talk to you again soon.